Hello. So let's talk a little bit about trifles in terms of the other things we've been looking at from script analysis. Um, so it's really important to point out with a play like Trifles the difference between plot and story. Plot is what we actually see happening on stage, and story is everything we know about all these characters. For example, the murder of Mr. Wright is part of the story. That happened before the play started. That's actually part of the stasis. Um, it, but we don't actually see it happening on stage. The plot are the things that we see happening on stage. So for the purposes of a play like Trifles, the plot is actually far less sensational than the story. I mean, the story is about a murder, and we find out, excuse me, we find out all these things about all the characters. Uh, we particularly find out a great deal about two people that aren't actually characters. Um, the murder mystery involves these two people that we never even see. Um, so when you're thinking about a play like Trifles, um, and most good plays probably, you actually want to ask yourself, what is the play about? Um, what are the themes and issues? Um, Trifles is very much a feminist play. Um, many of you, I'm sure, have read this in another class, and you probably discussed um, the feminist perspective of the play. The play is very much about what it means to be a woman in this time period. It's not today, it's set in the long ago. Um, and So when you come to analyze it in terms of things like, like what is the inciting incident? What is the climax? That is really important to a play like Trifles. You have to ask yourself what happens in the play? What is the event? The big questions that we wonder about, what is the central conflict? I always have to make myself a note because I get it confused. Which one is the sheriff's wife and which one is the neighbor? Mrs. Peters is the one who's married to the sheriff, and Mrs. Hale is the neighbor, as I'm sure your young, spry minds can remember easier than I can. Um, so we ask ourselves, after reading the play and thinking about it, what is the event of the play? What actually happens? Um, you could say that Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale solved the murder. Sure. Um, what happens in terms of the men? I don't know. They really aren't that different than they are at the beginning, so therefore they're probably not the central characters. Um, where have I put it here? Who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist? You can't say that Minnie Wright is the protagonist or even the antagonist. She's not seen on stage, so therefore she cannot be a main character. One would argue that she's actually not a character. The antagonist cannot be her husband, although we find out all these things that he did to her, and that she did to him. Um, so you have to ask yourself, who are the main characters? Arguably, it's Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. Um, I think it's actually speaks to the feminist quality of the play to say that there is not one um, protagonist. I think it's both of the women. If you were an actor playing one of these parts, you would probably say it was you, as you should. That would be the wise thing to do, to say it's a play about you. Um, but I think that they are both the uh, protagonist, and that the men, especially the attorney, is the antagonist. Um, what happens in the play, the event of the play, I feel like the event is these two women coming together. That reinforces the feminist theme. Feminism, one of the issues and themes of feminism is how the patriarchy gets women to fight against each other. And there are numerous times throughout the play where the sheriff's wife is saying things like, "Oh, but it's the law." She's the one who's like, "Oh, we have to follow the law." And eventually she goes against that thought, she changes her mind and agrees with Mrs. Hale to hide the bird, as we'll look at as we look through the play really briefly. So you could actually say that probably Mrs. Peters is the protagonist because she has the biggest change, but she doesn't do that without Mrs. Hale there to support her. So I would certainly not say that Mrs. Hale is the antagonist. So anyway, let's look at this play in terms of classic structure. It is very classically structured. The beginning is all of this stuff that I've highlighted in teal here is all that you've read the play, so you know what happens here. It's all the story. Hale gives you a bunch of information. This is classic playwriting 101, how to get a lot of information out for the audience. As you know, exposition are the facts. They're the things that we need to know as an audience to understand the play. And to create this sort of gimmick or sort of feature, the structural feature where someone has to tell somebody else a bunch of facts that that's a good way to get out some exposition. It's totally motivated exposition. Good playwriting always has motivated exposition. There's a reason for one character to say this to somebody else. You know, like if you're two brothers, if you say, hey, Uncle Johnny, who divorced his second wife when we were kids, you know, you don't say that because you know it. But for this case, Mr. Hale has to tell the court attorney all this information. Another way that happens is two people who don't really know each other very well. So they've covered both things here. So classic exposition. And we actually find out most of the stasis from here. Why Hale went over to the house. We find out a little bit about Mr. Wright. You know, we get a lot of the facts of the stasis. We know at the beginning of the play when the lights go up, it's very cold. There has been a murder. Nobody knows who did it yet. Minnie Wright has been arrested. And that's kind of the situation. They live out here in the middle of an extremely rural area, and it's cold. They may say a lot about it being cold. So usually after the exposition, you get the inciting incident. I feel that, I've highlighted a couple things here. The two women get closer together. They stand closer together for a moment. That sort of highlights what's to come. Where have I put it? I think the inciting incident is where did I put it? Let me find it. There it is. I highlighted it in a different color. I think the inciting incident is when the county attorney insults Mrs. Wright's housekeeping. We'll look at it in just a second. The climax, I feel, is when the two women come together to hide the bird. What brought that about? If the county attorney had not been such a stupid white straight male and been insulting to these women's way of life, these two women probably would not have come together to hide the bird. He's quite disparaging about the house, and the women defend Minnie Wright a little bit. But I just highlighted this one, not much of a housekeeper, and then Mrs. Hale sort of comes back with something. So I think that's what gets the wheels going, because remember, you've got your stasis, you understand the situation at the beginning of the play, then you have an inciting incident, then you have a series of complications or events, and then smaller events, and then you have the climax. And all of the events leading up to the climax help you get there. The inciting incident is the first one. So I feel that the inciting incident is when the attorney insults Mrs. Wright, because that brings the two women a little closer together. Anyway, and then we get This play is really structured conveniently through a series of French scenes when the men basically come and go because the women pretty much stay in the room. They leave quickly to get some stuff and come back, which I think would pose kind of a staging problem, um, leaving the stage empty for a couple seconds. But the men come and go, and when they come and go, that creates a different French scene. It helps give the play some structure. It feels like it divides the play up into scenes which it pretty much does. Um, Definitely divides the play into beats. When the men come and go, it's a different beat. However, there are beats within the sections where it's just the two women on stage. I'm not going to talk about beats in this short video. Um, so, Mrs. Hale, why did I highlight this? I'd hate to come. I'd hate men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing. So they refer to that quite a few times. The women bring up how insulting the men are. The women frequently bring up differences between what it means to be a man and a woman in this day and age that this play takes place in. So you get scenes between the two women. They discover things. They basically solve the mystery, and we know it's the trifles that solve the mystery that only the women can see because the men are too busy being stupid men, insulting arrogant men. Um, so, yeah, you get your series of events. This is not very difficult to understand. They discover the yarn or the sewing is messed up. They find the bird, they find the cage, then they find the bird's body, which pretty much cinches the deal. Uh, the the men laugh and the women look abashed. So again, it's adding to that. I know they're insulting the things that the women find important. Um, so it adds to that conflict. Man versus woman is the conflict. You could arguably say straight man versus straight white men versus straight white women nonetheless, but still very much marginalized at this point in time. So we get more discoveries. Why have I highlighted this? Mrs. Peters asked, here they are, they're coming together. At the beginning of the play, the two women are strangers. And throughout the play, we see them coming together. So that's why I feel that is the event of the play. The women come together to solve the crime. You could simply just say the women solve the crime, but I think it's a lot more, speaks thematically to what the play is about to say that the women come together. So, yeah, and Mrs. Hale, wishes she had been a better friend, a better female friend to Mrs. Wright. So, we get more complications. We have the sewing basket. Oh, they find the bird. Their eyes meet, a look of growing comprehension. They solve the case pretty much. And then, see, we get Mrs. Peters pushing back a little bit. The law has got to punish crime, but then Mrs. Hale, oh, I wish you come there. Me not coming here was the crime. So this is sort of juxtaposing women's law, if you want to put it that way. I realize that's a dramatic thing for me to say, but the moralities, that what's important, what it means to be a woman, I violated that, and that was definitely a crime. That's very much a concept of feminist theory. Mrs. Hale, I might have known she needed help. For women, I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together but far apart. So yeah, so reinforcing the theme, the event of the play. Again, attorney says, oh, blah, 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 says this bit here that I've highlighted. He says, oh, you ever think of it, Mrs. Peters, you're actually married to the law? Mrs. Peters, no, not really. We see Mrs. Peters beginning to evolve as a character. And then we get the climax here. The men are about to come in and they've got to do something with the bird. Suddenly Mrs. Peters throws back the quilt pieces that the bird was wrapped up in and tries to put the box that the bird was in her bag. It's too big. So this is Mrs. Peters changing her mind. This is Mrs. Peters breaking the law pretty much. And at the beginning, she was not really quite so ready to do that. It's not going to get in there. It's not going to get in her bag that she brought, her own bag that she's going to hide the bird from. Um, so she opens the box, starts to take out the bird. The bag, ew, I can't touch the bird. Um, she uh, she's helpless. The men are coming, adding tension, and then Mrs. Hale helps her. She snatches the box and puts it in her pocket. So these two women coming together to hide the evidence from the men to protect another woman. And you could even go as far to say it ends with a metaphor. They were going to knot it. These two women have tied a knot together. Not a marriage, I'm certainly not saying that, but they have come together since tied their friendship up. So, yeah, so that is an interpretation of this play. I don't need to show you this anymore. The play is very much a feminist play. I don't think anybody would argue against that. But the main thing is because at first glance, many people who are new to script analysis would say the inciting incident was Minnie killing her husband. That can't be it because it doesn't happen on stage. We don't see that happen. And when you go to analyze, what exactly is the inciting incident and climax for a play like Trifles, you really have to think about what the play is about. And the play is about being a woman at this period in time. And hope I'm not making you dizzy. That, yeah, that's what the play is about. So yeah, so that's how you do it. And that is Trifles.